There is a moment, historians argue about, which one exactly, when a single human being held more of the earth's fate in his hands than anyone since Caesar. He was not born to power. He was not tall. He did not come from money, from nobility, from any of the things that Europe said a man must have to rule. He came from a small island most Frenchmen couldn't find on a map, and in 15 years, he rewrote every border on the continent. August 15th, 1769. The town of Ajaccio, on the island of Corsica. A boy is born into a minor noble family, the Bonapartes. His name is Napoleone. Corsica had only been French for 1 year. His mother, Letizia, was a formidable woman who would outlive most of her children. His father, Carlo, was a lawyer who understood that in the new French order, a letter of nobility, even a thin one, could open doors. He leveraged that letter hard. At 9 years old, Napoleone was sent to school in France, Brienne-le-Château, a military boarding school in the Champagne region. He was different here, poorer than the other students, with a thick Corsican accent, a name no one could pronounce, and a pride that refused to shrink to fit the room. The other boys called him the foreigner. He ate alone. He didn't fight back with his fists. He fought back with mathematics, with military history, with artillery theory. He became, by every account, exceptional at the things that mattered for war. He seemed to feel his isolation and responded by retreating into himself, his schoolmate, decades later. In 1784, at 15, he transferred to the École Militaire in Paris, the most prestigious military academy in France. He completed the 2-year course in 1. He graduated ranked 42nd out of 58 in his class. But in artillery, his specialty, he was among the best. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the French artillery. He was 16 years old. Then France caught fire. The revolution of 1789 did something no military school could have. It destroyed the old aristocratic officer class overnight. Suddenly, the French army needed new commanders, men who were talented, not titled, men who could win. Napoleon was perfectly positioned. He was a soldier. He was ambitious. And he had studied war the way other young men studied poetry. He navigated the revolution's factions carefully. He was a Jacobin when it helped, pragmatic always. But it was a single battle in the autumn of 1793 that announced him to the world. Toulon. The port city had fallen to British-backed royalists. The French army had been besieging it for months and going nowhere. A young artillery captain arrived and looked at the situation with fresh eyes. He identified a single hill overlooking the harbour, Fort Mulgrave, the British called it. Take that hill, he argued, and you can bombard the British fleet into leaving. Without naval support, the city falls. His commanders thought he was too young to know what he was talking about. They let him try anyway. He took the hill. The British fleet sailed away. Toulon surrendered. Napoleon was 24. By the end of the week, he was a brigadier general. A man named Augustin Robespierre wrote to Paris, "I lack the words to describe the merit of this officer." He would not need words for long. Everyone was about to learn Napoleon's name. By 1796, the revolution had eaten itself. The Committee of Public Safety was gone, replaced by a 5-man executive called the Directory, corrupt, incompetent, and nearly bankrupt. France was at war with Austria and Britain, and the war was going nowhere good. Napoleon, now married to the widow Joséphine de Beauharnais, was given command of the Army of Italy, the worst supplied, most demoralized force in the French military. Some 40,000 men who hadn't been paid in months. he rode to the front and addressed them in a speech that has become legend. "Soldiers, you are hungry and nearly naked. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. Your patience and your courage are admirable, but they give you no glory, no fame. I am about to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." What followed was one of the most breathtaking military campaigns in history. In 12 months, Napoleon fought 12 pitched battles and won them all. He didn't outgun his enemies, he outwitted them. He moved his army faster than any opponent expected, struck where defenses were thin, divided enemy forces and destroyed them piece by piece. Montenotte, Lodi, where he personally aimed the guns on a bridge under fire, and his soldiers started calling him the Little Corporal. Arcola, Rivoli, each name a hammer blow to Austrian power in Italy. Austria had held northern Italy for generations. Napoleon cleared it in a year. He didn't just win battles. He reshaped the map. He created new republics, the Cisalpine Republic, the Ligurian Republic, client states of France, political laboratories for the ideas of the revolution. He negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio himself, cutting out the Directory, acting as if he were already a head of state, because in a way, he was. Napoleon came home to Paris a hero. Crowds gathered in the streets. The Directory, terrified of his popularity and relieved to have him far away, approved his next plan, an expedition to Egypt. The logic was geopolitical. Egypt was an Ottoman province that sat astride trade routes to India. If France controlled it, Britain's empire could be threatened at its jugular. Napoleon also brought 167 scholars, scientists, and artists. He intended to study Egypt as much as conquer it. The Rosetta Stone was found on this expedition. That's the kind of campaign it was. The fighting, however, did not go as planned. Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, stranding Napoleon's army. A march into Syria collapsed at the siege of Acre. Disease ravaged his men. The dream of an Eastern Empire evaporated in the desert heat. Napoleon did what great opportunists always do. He paid attention to what was happening at home. France was in crisis, military disasters in Europe, political chaos in Paris. He abandoned his army in Egypt, slipped past the British naval blockade, and sailed back to France. He arrived on October 9th, 1799. 30 days later, the Directory was gone. The coup of 18 Brumaire, November 9th, 1799 by the revolutionary calendar, was almost comic in its near failure. Napoleon, surrounded by guards, stormed into the legislative councils to dissolve them. When he entered the chamber, a deputy lunged at him, grabbed him by the collar. Soldiers had to drag Napoleon out. It was his brother Lucien, president of the lower house, who saved him, telling the guards dramatically that Napoleon had been attacked by assassins. The deputies were expelled at bayonet point. By midnight, France had a new government. Napoleon was first consul, first among three, in theory. In practice, he was everything. People imagine Napoleon primarily as a general. That's understandable. But the years between 1799 and 1804 may have been his most consequential, and they were spent largely at a desk. He commissioned the Napoleonic Code, a unified legal framework that abolished feudalism, guaranteed equality before the law, protected property rights, established freedom of religion, and abolished privileges of birth. It is, right now, the foundation of legal systems in France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Quebec, Louisiana, and over 40 other countries. He reorganized the French state top to bottom. Prefects to administer regions, the Banque de France to stabilize the economy, a new lycée system for education, a concordat with the Catholic Church to restore religious stability after the revolution's chaos. He was extraordinarily productive and almost never slept. He once said he could work for 18 hours at a stretch, and he expected everyone around him to keep up. Few could. Pope Pius VII had been brought all the way from Rome for the coronation. He sat in Notre Dame expecting to place the imperial crown on Napoleon's head, the traditional act of papal authority over monarchs. Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself. He owed his power to no one. Then he crowned Josephine. The crowd thundered. Europe watched in stunned silence. If Napoleon had died the morning after Austerlitz, we would still call him great. What happened there on December 2nd, 1805, was a military performance so precise that military academies still study it today. He was facing the combined armies of Austria and Russia, the Third Coalition, larger than his own force and commanded by experienced generals. He did something counterintuitive. He deliberately weakened his right flank, making it look like his army was stretched thin and exhausted. The coalition took the bait. They pushed hard against his right, pouring men off the high ground of the Pratzen Heights to overwhelm it. The moment they left the heights, Napoleon struck the center with his full force, captured the Pratzen, and then wheeled left and right, cutting the Allied army in half. The fighting lasted 9 hours. The result, 27,000 coalition casualties. Napoleon lost fewer than 9,000. The Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 years old, dissolved the following year. Napoleon sent word to Vienna that it was no longer necessary. By 1807, after the Treaty of Tilsit with Tsar Alexander I, signed on a raft in the middle of a river because neither man trusted the other's ground, Napoleon controlled more of Europe than any ruler since Charlemagne. Think about the scale. He had placed his brothers on the thrones of Spain, Naples, Holland, and Westphalia. His marshals governed Poland, Croatia, Catalonia. His enemies had been beaten into alliance or submission. The map of Europe had been remade from scratch, and yet, and this is the first crack, it was never quite enough. Britain could not be invaded. Nelson had guaranteed that at Trafalgar in 1805, destroying the French fleet. So Napoleon tried to strangle the British economy instead. The continental system, a blockade forbidding any European nation from trading with Britain. To enforce it completely, he needed control of Portugal, which kept trading with the British. He marched his army through Spain. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Spanish people had not been consulted about the French army crossing their land. When Napoleon removed the Spanish king and replaced him with his brother Joseph, Spain erupted. Not in pitched battles, the Spanish army was crushed quickly, but in guerrilla war. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, was coined in this conflict. It was the kind of war Napoleon had no answer for. Every road was dangerous, every village was hostile. Every week, French soldiers disappeared, ambushed, killed. The British army under Wellington landed in Portugal and began pushing steadily eastward. Napoleon later called the Peninsular War his Spanish ulcer, a wound that never healed and slowly drained his strength. From 1808 to 1814, he was never fully free of it. 300,000 French soldiers were tied down in Spain, 300,000 men he needed elsewhere. There was another problem, private, painful, and politically existential. Josephine had not given him a child. After 15 years of marriage, Napoleon made the coldest calculation of his life. He divorced her. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, 18 years old, daughter of the emperor he had humiliated repeatedly in battle. The dynasty he was trying to build needed a son. In 1811, Marie-Louise gave him one, Napoleon Francis Joseph, the King of Rome. He was 42 years old. He had a son, an empire, and an Austria that was now, by marriage, his family. He had everything a dynasty needed. He had about 18 months to enjoy it. The alliance with Russia had never been comfortable. Tsar Alexander was tolerating Napoleon, not submitting to him. Russia had begun quietly trading with Britain again, violating the continental system. There were border tensions. There was pride, on both sides, that could not be indefinitely managed. Napoleon convinced himself that one decisive campaign would settle it. A massive show of force, the largest army Europe had ever seen, would march to Moscow, and Alexander, like every other monarch before him, would negotiate. On June 24th, 1812, the Grande Armée crossed into Russia. 680,000 men, French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, every nation of the empire. It was the largest military force ever assembled in the history of the world. The Russians did not fight. They retreated, and as they retreated, they burned. Crops, villages, food stores, anything that could sustain an invading army, burned. Napoleon had expected a short, decisive campaign. Instead, his army marched hundreds of miles into an increasingly empty landscape, chasing an enemy that refused to stand and be destroyed. The supply lines stretched and then broke. Men began dying, not from Russian bullets, but from heat in July, then disease, then later from something worse. Borodino, September 7th, 1812. The Russians finally turned to fight, 80 miles from Moscow. It was the bloodiest single day of fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, possibly the bloodiest single day in any war to that point. 70,000 casualties combined in 12 hours. Neither side could claim a true victory. The Russians retreated. Napoleon marched into Moscow a week later. He sat in the Kremlin and waited for Alexander to send terms. No terms came. The Tsar did not negotiate. He simply refused. 5 weeks passed. The days grew shorter. The temperature began to drop. Napoleon ordered the retreat on October 19th. Winter arrived early. The temperature fell to -30 Celsius. Men who had been soldiers of the greatest army in the world froze to death in their sleep. Horses died by the thousands, taking with them the army's artillery and supply wagons. The Cossacks harassed the columns day and night. The bridges over the Berezina River were gone. Engineers built makeshift crossings under fire while the rear guard fought to hold back pursuing Russian forces. Thousands drowned in the freezing river. Of the 680,000 men who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 came back in any condition to fight. Europe saw it. Every king who had been cowed by the French armies saw it, and they understood. Napoleon was not invincible. What followed was a war of annihilation, not of armies, but of an empire. Prussia, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Britain, the Sixth Coalition, came at France from every direction. Napoleon was still dangerous. He won battles in early 1813, even with his shattered forces. He outmaneuvered armies with the old brilliance, but there were too many of them now, and they had learned from him. They stopped meeting him directly when he was concentrated. They attacked his flanks, his supply lines, his satellite states. October 1813, Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, 4 days of fighting, 360,000 coalition troops against less than 200,000 French. Napoleon was encircled and nearly captured. He escaped across a bridge, which his engineers then blew up prematurely, stranding 30,000 of his own men inside the city. The empire unraveled. His satellite kingdoms collapsed like dominoes. His marshals began to desert him, not from cowardice, but from calculation. They had families, properties, titles. They had things to lose. By March 1814, coalition armies were marching on Paris. Napoleon was still in the field, still fighting. 30 different engagements in 6 weeks, a display of generalship that amazed his enemies even as they drove him back. But it wasn't enough. On April 6, 1814, at the Palace of Fontainebleau, Napoleon abdicated. For the first time in his life, he wept in front of his marshals. He was sent to Elba, a small island off the Tuscan coast. He was given sovereignty over it. He was given a small guard. He was given the title of Emperor of Elba, a consolation prize the size of a village. He lasted 10 months. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with about 1,000 soldiers and landed in southern France. What happened next defies rational explanation. The French king sent an army to intercept him. At Laffrey, Napoleon walked out alone in front of the royalist soldiers, opened his coat, and said, "If any of you wishes to shoot his emperor, here I am." The soldiers lowered their guns. Then they joined him. It happened again and again as he marched north. Regiments sent to stop him became his escort. Marshal Ney, who had promised the king to bring Napoleon back in an iron cage, rode out to confront him and ended up kissing him on both cheeks. On March the 20th, 1815, 20 days after landing, Napoleon walked into the Tuileries Palace in Paris. The king had fled the night before. France had gone from royalist restoration to Napoleonic Empire in less than 3 weeks, without a single shot fired. He had 90 days. History calls them the 100 days. He knew the coalition would not accept this. He had to strike before they could coordinate, hit them in Belgium while their forces were still assembling. He moved with the old speed, crossing into Belgium and driving a wedge between Wellington's Anglo-Dutch army and the Prussians. He was almost there. At Ligny on June 16th, he defeated the Prussians, but did not destroy them. Marshal Ney botched the action at Quatre Bras on the same day. The pieces were slightly off. June 18th, 1815, Waterloo, Wellington held a ridge. Napoleon attacked all day. The British line bent and buckled, but held. And then, in the late afternoon, the Prussians arrived on Napoleon's flank. The French army collapsed into chaos. The rout was total. Napoleon fled the field. He reached Paris 4 days later and abdicated again. This time, there would be no return. He tried to escape to America. The British blocked every port. On July 15, 1815, he boarded HMS Bellerophon and surrendered to the captain. He paced the deck and stared at the English coast he had tried so long to reach by force. "I come, like Themistocles, to throw myself upon the hospitality of the British people." The British sent him to Saint Helena. Saint Helena is, by most measures, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. The British chose it deliberately. It took 2 months to sail there. It was ringed by cliffs. There was no escape. Napoleon was given Longwood House, a damp, wind-blasted property that he complained about relentlessly, and a small entourage of loyal companions. The British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, watched him with barely concealed suspicion and restricted his movements. For 6 years, he waited. And while he waited, he did something that would prove more powerful than any battle. He wrote. He dictated his memoirs obsessively, day after day, to his companions. He was not writing history, he was writing his own legend. He repositioned himself as the defender of the revolution, the champion of peoples against kings, the man who had spread liberty across Europe. He polished his battles into masterpieces. He blamed his marshals for his defeats. He made Waterloo into a tragedy of circumstance rather than a failure of command. He was a brilliant propagandist, and he had years and nothing else to do by the time the memoirs began circulating in Europe, and they circulated fast. The image of Napoleon the Liberator had begun to eclipse Napoleon the Conqueror. He died on May 5, 1821. He was 51 years old. The official cause was stomach cancer. Some historians have debated other causes, including arsenic poisoning. The wallpaper in Longwood House contained a pigment that could produce toxic gas in the damp climate. His last words were reportedly, "France, Army, Head of the Army, Josephine." His body was returned to Paris in 1840, a massive state procession through the streets, hundreds of thousands watching. He was interred at Les Invalides, where he still lies today, in a tomb of red porphyry so large that his veterans had to descend steps to bow to him. He had designed it that way from exile in his will. The Napoleonic Code governs legal systems on every inhabited continent. The idea of merit over birth, that talent should determine position, not family, became the foundational assumption of modern governance. The metric system, still used by virtually the entire world, was standardized under his administration. The modern university system in France, central banking, the concept of the citizen soldier, the nationalisms that would define the 19th and 20th centuries were, in many ways, reactions to Napoleon, peoples who had been stamped with French boots deciding they wanted their own flags, their own states, their own futures. He tried to unite Europe by force. What he actually created was the idea that Europe's peoples had distinct identities worth fighting for. Whether that is a legacy of liberation or of destruction depends on who you ask, and where their ancestors were in 1812. He was a child of the revolution, who became the thing the revolution had killed. He was a liberator who enslaved. He was the greatest general of his age and the architect of his own destruction. He conquered most of Europe and lost it twice. He loved Josephine so fiercely that he couldn't bring himself to hate her after the divorce. He wept openly at music. He dictated letters faster than any secretary could write. He slept 4 hours a night and thought it was enough. More books have been written about Napoleon Bonaparte than about any other human being except Jesus of Nazareth. He was 24 when he took Toulon, 30 when he overthrew a government, 34 when he crowned himself, 45 when it ended. He was a man so completely suited to his extraordinary moment in history that it is almost impossible to imagine what he would have been without it, and equally impossible to imagine what that moment would have been without him.